Hey, your favorite MMO tank Eyeduka is back, and if you're here, you're probably looking for a good tank build for the new expansion in Throne and Liberty. And maybe you're tired of all these big endgame builds because they're gonna take you like months before you can get to that point. So that's why I'm here for you guys. Today I'm going to show you actual early game builds for Crusader. What rules do we have to consider those in early game builds? So first of all these items that I'm going to show you are only coming from dungeons. So that's the number one rule. And you can check here on Maxroll website. You can see the sources, and basically all the items I'm using today are going to be coming from dungeons. So we're not going to have any field boss or arch boss weapons or any other items as well. And also no Nebula Island accessories as well. So just dungeons, right? This is all early game stuff. The next rule is that we're not going to have resonance effect. Also, we're only using blue runes, not purple. So you can go a bit further later in the game with purples. Another thing that we're going to skip for these builds are the artifacts. We're not going to use any artifacts. And the last rule is masteries. You see, I've only set up to 90. Technically, if you have both of your weapons to level 20 right now, you should get 80 points on each. I put 90 as an exception just so that you can see the first epic skill that you're going to unlock at 80. You're going to put 10 points in there. That's like the only small exception, which, is just going to take a little bit more time. That's fine. Also, I'm not going to go through every single individual item and, all the traits, all the runes and, skills and so on and so on, because I have a couple of builds for you today. And this would take hours to go through all of those. I'm going to post a link in the description so you can check all these builds for yourself, maybe play around with them. Maybe, change something if you want. You can come up with better builds. So let's just go quickly through them. And then later, I'm just going to compare them. The main key points that you want to take is that if you're focusing on PvE, you can follow these builds. And when it comes to traits, runes, and stuff like that, you don't really need to stack too much endurance just for PvE. You may want to have some extra skill damage resistance, HP. Also, you don't need too much hit chance as well. It's just for PvE. Anytime you have the option, you can choose a bit more offensive DPS type of items while maintaining the tankiness of the build so that you have some higher DPS while not losing too much of your defense capabilities. However, if you're going for any of the PvP builds, you should probably prioritize a bit more endurance, resistance, things like that over HP, and also maybe lower down some DPS stats to get more hit chance. It depends on your playstyle, what you want to get into. Again, keep in mind, if you want to do PvP as well, then I would recommend going for a PvP build because you're still going to be able to do PvE with the PvP build, but not the other way around. It's just maybe not going to be the most optimal solution. Then you can always play around with these builds and maybe make something like a hybrid, something that's good in both. It's not going to be perfect in any of the two scenarios, but it may be decent enough for both of them. So that's really up to your preference. Also keep in mind with these new items, I'm looking at the stats and they're all over the place. Some stats are great for PvE, but not so good for PvP on the same item. The combination of stats that we have, that's the crazy thing. For instance, if you look at these, you've got the Celestial Cyclone Warblade, which gives you stun chance and perception, which is great for PvP. However, the passive effect is for Blazing Tornado, which I don't really see many people using in PvP, but maybe things are going to change. Then the other thing is, for instance, Blade of Fiendish Fortitude, which has strength, which is overall perfectly fine. Cooldown is great for every scenario as well. But hit chance, you're going to need that mostly for PvP. You're not going to need that too much in PvE. So that's something to just keep in mind. Anyway, on this build, that's like the main tank build that I came up with. I'm using the Wraith Knight set with both of the effects on. And all of these, well, we don't have huge choices when it comes to necklaces. There are only like 2 necklaces that come from dungeons. You have a few more options when it comes to the other accessories, but I choose those for now. You have a more tanky cloak that you can choose if you want, which I choose for PvP. You might be just overkilling anyway, and might as well go for this one, Silver Fur Decorated Cloak, because it's just going to give you some extra DPS stats. The skills for all the builds are very similar to what I'm currently using, so I'm not going to go through them individually, but you can just check them later on the build. We go to the masteries now. For 90 points, you can't really get that many things. Starting from the sword, Obviously, as a tank, we're going to prioritize the defensive options right here. However, not all of the passive effects are really that great for us. So I'm using this one right here. We have Resurgence. On the defense one, I skip both of these. I don't really go for evasion stuff. We can increase even more skill damage resistance, but the thing is, I'm going to lose a lot of DPS stats. That's why I don't do that. However, this one seems to be just perfectly fine. I don't see that huge DPS loss. When it comes to the epic skills, Second Wind and Undying seem to be great for PvP, but not so much for PvE, because once again, you don't really need too much endurance. That's my idea right here. I don't know if things are going to change dramatically if you need a lot of endurance in PvE as well, but I don't think so. And then that's just critical damage resistance as well. Also not super great for PvE anyway. That's why I choose Crusader, which is just going to give you extra healing regardless of your wisdom. But most of the times we are probably going to be below 40 wisdom. However, this is really up to you. You can pretty much go above 40 wisdom as well. Either way, it's a great buff. And we also use these passive right here, which is supposed to be your overall level of weapon masteries. So if you have both of your weapons to 80, that means you have 160. You should have this one unlocked, which for this situation, I choose Overcome Crisis. Then we look at the Greatsword. It's kind of in the same direction, going around defensive stuff. I've got Vital Energy, Undoubted Spirit, then we have Ironclad Armor, and Unbreakable Will. All of these seems to have mostly positive effect and not that many negatives, so that's just perfect. Also, whenever you have the option, most of the time try to choose these knots on these sides. Like for instance, in this situation, I'm using both of these sections, and this would count as one for each of the section, which they're just connected. And these don't have negative impacts most of the time. They're only positives, while the smaller knots, very often they have some small negative effect. And then for the epic knot, I use hand-to-hand combat. For PvE, I would say it's more beneficial if you have below 70 perception, so you increase your stun and collision resistance, because these resistances are useful in PvE as well. When the actual stun and collision chance for PvE is not that useful anyway. Most of the time you're gonna have guaranteed stun and collisions anyway, unless there's again something really dramatic that changes. But that's for this build. Then we're gonna look at the early DPS Crusader. We're gonna be using very similar items. You might consider mostly what we're changing here is the weapons and a little bit of stat redistribution. The rune combinations also change a little bit simply because we want to hit different thresholds right here. But other than that, I'm still maintaining the tank type of build because, in the end of the day, you still want to be a tank and not just switch to full cloth or leather armor so that you're going to have way less defense while still using the same weapons. Yeah, you're still Crusader, but I want to have the more classical view of the tank. You can go for strictly DPS items, but as you probably already know, it's going to be really difficult to farm and gear up and have like multiple sets of items. This is why it's best to just focus on one build and over time maybe add a couple of additional items that you can just swap around for different situations. But early on, it's best to just focus on one build. In this case, I'm changing the weapons. As you can see, on the tank build, I'm using Blade of Fiendish Fortitude and Grey-Eye Destructive Bloodsword, mostly because of the stats and the HP, but we're also going to get very good cooldown reduction. Other than that, the passives are not like super amazing, but they're actually just helping you sustain more, which is great for PvE tanking anyway. However, for DPS, I'm actually swapping to these. The reason here is simply this one, the Bulwark of Invulnerability, is going to give you skill damage boost, which is kind of a rare and unique stat that you're not going to see on that many items. And the Immortal Titanic Quakeblade, which technically has more of a PvP stats on it. As you can see, we have hit chance and collision chance, which are not super useful in PvE, but the passive looks pretty interesting and pretty powerful, and we're using quite a lot of Gaia Crush anyway. And that's just going to boost your Gaia Crush a lot. It's going to give you extra range, extra damage, and it's going to apply 4 times in one place. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to interact the same way like other similar skills where you can only use it for one version of the Gaia Crush, where you can have an upgraded version, which is Frost Cleaving. And just like other weapons, you cannot have the 2 effects together. So that's kind of a question. It doesn't specify here. Maybe in the game, going to see that message just like other weapons where you're not going to be able to use Frost Cleaving and Judgment Wave at the same time. But either way, that still looks a bit better in terms of DPS for me anyway. But you can also go with the other one if you feel like it. It's not going to be a huge downside. You still have other stats that are pretty decent as well. And when it comes to PvP, if you want to focus on PvP builds early game, I would probably go with these two weapons anyway, the Invulnerability and Titanic Waveblade. But getting back to this build, again, most of the other things are pretty much the same. As you see, we don't really have any difference here, just the weapons, right? Also, most of your runes and traits are going to be also similar. The only difference here is the rune synergy, because we want to hit different stat thresholds right here. If you look at this, we have 70 straight, 51 dexterity for this threshold, we have 32 wisdom, get this one, and 50 perception. And for the DPS build, we focus on slightly higher dexterity, again 70 strength, wisdom is a bit less, but that's fine, and perception is still above 50. The extra dexterity is just going to give us extra DPS overall. Then the mastery stuff, obviously this time we're going to focus on the red zone. This is mostly DPS oriented stuff. And you do have quite a lot of negative effects coming from this, which are going to make you way less tankier. Keep that in mind. However, in open world grinding, very often you might even be in groups, so survivability is not going to be that much of a problem. And you want to have as high DPS as possible. That's why we focus on these. And we put most of the passives that we have access to. For instance, Wave of Annihilation, Crushing Blow, Pulverizing Strike, and Repel, which is the ultimate. It's going to give you a lot of extra damage to your sword skills while reducing your defenses. Keep that in mind. Down here we have Adamantine Skin, which is basically buffing your Impenetrable to have more than 10 targets additional effects. Going to give you more defense overall, which is kind of going to remove the negative side of these effects, because you're just going to have more defense, but if you have a lot of enemies around you. So even more than before, it's going to be perfect for you to just stack as many enemies as possible. That's only going to make you stronger anyway. And then going to the Greatsword, pretty much all in this section once again. We're using Vital Energy, Undoubted Spirit. We got Forceful Grasp, Furious Rampage, Berserker Blades, and Blood Fighter. And technically Blood Fighter is pretty much the most broken of all epics, because it doesn't look like you have negative side on this one. Basically, it's just positives. If your health is 50% or higher, your critical damage will increase. Very often you'll be more than 50% anyway. But if it goes below 50%, critical damage resistance is increased. So it's just the two different effects that apply at different times, which is super unique, super versatile. That's perfect. And we're pretty much using the same Overcome Crisis. I mean, if you look at them at level 130, you don't have a lot of great stuff. Technically, all the good stuff come once you get to 520 and above, which is really difficult. You're going to have to grind a lot of these. But that's, again, personal preference. You can just play around with these. Then right here, we can actually just compare the two builds just as a reference. Of course, they have completely different purpose, but just so you know what is the difference. The damage is kind of similar. It's not a huge difference. You do have quite a lot more shield block chance on the tank build, which is great. That's exactly what we need. On the DPS build, of course, you have all these critical stats quite a lot higher, like critical hit chance and heavy attack chance. Keep in mind, this is a wrong representation of the heavy attack chance. I think I mentioned that before. It's still not fixed. As you can see, we have 647 heavy attack chance, and this one has 772, but there's one bonus effect that's not shown here. Down in the bottom, it says Wraith Knight Set, and it gives you 2.8. This is wrong. At 20,000 HP, you should get 240, which is quite a lot higher, which will result in basically you getting to close to 900 here. And here, you're getting to about more than 1,000. So that is huge. You're going to have quite a lot of heavy attacks. It's just, there are a couple of small bugs here, but in game, we're going to see, most likely, you're going to see the right stats. Hit chance is not so relevant in PvE. Damage reduction is not a huge thing. Defense, obviously, you have much higher defense on the tank build, which is perfectly fine. Evasion is not important for us. Endurance, again, you have some stats, but they're not crazy important in both of these scenarios. You do have some, obviously. The stat points distribution is just slightly different, but it's also in the same range. The HP is just slightly higher here on the tank build, but you're still pretty good on this one. Mana regen and mana cost efficiency, kind of similar, not a huge difference here. Skill damage boost, now this is the main thing here. Because of the Bulwark of Invulnerability, you get quite a lot higher skill damage boost, which is great. Cooldown speed, that's a huge difference, which is mostly coming from the weapons. Both of these weapons have cooldown speed. This could be a downside. If you feel like you really need that, you can play around with some of the stats, probably put some of these on, but that's really up to you. You have skill heal right here. Buff duration is almost the same. Debuff duration is pretty low on both of them anyway, because we prioritize different stats. The resistances, obviously on the tank one, we have slightly higher resistances, but in PvE, they're not super important. Of course, stun and collision resistance is, again, the most common things that you're going to find even in PvE, so you want to get some of these as well. Crowd controls, not a huge difference either way. They're not super important in PvE anyway, so that's fine. And you have the hidden stats. If somebody knows how these apply, how they combine with the other stats, please let me know in the comments below. I'm not quite sure how this works. Like, are they added to these? Is this like a separate stat? Are they actually automatically in there? Not quite sure, because right here it says that is coming from dexterity already. Then if you go to the criticals, again, it shows dexterity. So it's hidden, but at the same time, it feels like it's already applied to the main stats. I'm not 100% sure how this works, but that's just to quickly get an idea. So now we're looking at the PvP builds. So the first one I got is the Vanguard set, which for this purpose, we're going to use the full set because we're stacking a bit of fortitude. Want to get both of these stats. And without the spear, we can only get to about 50-ish fortitude. You can go a bit higher if you want, but I want to get the other thresholds. Also, we want to get as high as possible perception and strength, also at 70. So that's about it. We changed some of the accessories here, obviously. And once again, the major difference is the runes and the traits. We want to get more heavy attack chance, heavy attack evasion, collision chance, collision resistance, stuff like that, generally speaking. And now when it comes to the masteries, again, we're pretty much using very similar things right here. With the small difference right now that we're gonna add Garrett's Will. We're gonna avoid this one because we're gonna lose a lot of DPS potential, and we wanna have heavy attacks. Basically, if it was criticals, it's fine. We're not relying on criticals for this build, but heavy attack is important because otherwise we have no damage altogether. So for the PvP masteries, this time it's mostly the same, but this time we changed the epic skill to Undying. Now there's something really funny you're gonna see later with this. I did felt like it's something wrong about it, but based on what it says here, it's supposed to increase your endurance by 2 points and increase your main weapon base damage by 60 per 100 of max HP up to 30,000. Now this already seems to be super broken because you're gonna get quite a lot of endurance, but also your base damage will be reduced to a significantly negative value. So I'm not quite sure how this exactly works. Maybe it's a little bit broken. Maybe it's not explained right here properly. Or the whole idea is that you'd have 0 main weapon damage while being a little bit tankier. Like, it's not going to make you immortal. So I'm not sure if this is really the best thing. But again, this is all just theory crafting right now, because I can't really call this a build or any build before it's actually tested on the field. So all of that is just theory crafting anyway. Then for the greatsword, I'm still using hand-to-hand combat. This time, however, because we are at 70 perception, we're going to get more stun and collision hit chance instead of resistance, which is great, so we can counter others that actually stack a lot of resistance, which is really important because we want to control the field in PvP. But then most of the other things are very similar to what we had before. Again, prioritize the major middle nodes right here because they just have positive effects. Then for the other builds that I have, I'm using the same mastery, so I'm not going to go through that again, obviously, and pretty much the same skill setup. But again, you can look at these on the description because they're pretty much the same like the ones that I use right now in tier 1. So we're going to go to the second PvP build, which is Skilled Veteran. So that's a completely different set. This one is more like team-oriented build simply because your set effects actually party buffs. So that's just perfect in this situation. Most build things are pretty much the same. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the armor, specifically the armor for a couple of the sets. The Skilled Veteran armor, the chest piece, has the highest range defense. So naturally, if you're planning on countering specific builds, then you have to look at this and keep that in mind. And the highest melee defense that you can find is actually Holy Ghost. It's right here. That's 599. You can actually combine the same set, obviously, and just have the different armor if you want to counter specifically melee builds. But you're going to have to change a couple of other pieces because most of the time I just change the pants. I really don't like the set pants most of the time, but you can play around with this. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to meta, and generally speaking, look at it this way. You have 4 melee weapons in the game. You have 2 ranged weapons and 2 magic weapons. And most of the time, when it comes to DPS, most of the people would be using some melee weapon or both, while the magic and range have some DPS but also some support, so they may have the potential to do a lot of damage. But then realistically, the most common enemies you're going to find are going to be melee users anyway. That's based on my experience. It could be different, could change, of course, but keep that in mind. If you're trying to counter specific things, maybe the best case is to counter melee. And you're going to see very often that I stack mostly melee heavy attack evasion and sometimes a bit higher melee endurance. But you know, that's really questionable. On this build, for most of the PvP builds, I usually try to balance between the 3, but you can obviously push higher on any of these specifically. This is really up to you. When it comes to criticals, range classes do have pretty good access to critical damage, but also melee when it comes to daggers. So you got to keep that in mind. And when it comes to heavy attacks, I know for a fact that based on, what I'm playing right now, melee weapons, specifically greatsword, do have a lot of things that go around with heavy attacks. So you want to maybe stack a bit more heavy attack evasion. But again, this is really based on your preference. What do you want to actually counter? I actually have kind of a hybrid build, which maybe I'm going to try to do something like that, but I'm not 100% sure. And actually the other builds also share one specific thing. It's the cloak. That's a completely different cloak, and some of the accessories. But when it comes to this build, I'm basically trying to do both PvE and PvP. So it's not going to be the best for both of the scenarios, but I may want to just stack on the resistances and more PvP related stats, however, using this gear. And when it comes to the set bonuses, you can look at the Vanguard, which the first one is giving you endurance based on perception. So in PvE, that's not exactly really that great, but in PvP is actually good. And the second stat is just increasing your main weapon damage when it comes to fortitude. And you want to stack fortitude generally in PvP anyway because of endurance and magic defense as well. The price for getting that base weapon damage is coming from fortitude, so it's not the best thing in PvE. The same thing goes for skilled veteran, which generally just gives you damage reduction and endurance for you and party members. Damage reduction is great, but it's not like the top thing anyway. But when it comes to the Wraith Knight set, it's giving you stats that are generally great for both PvE and PvP. And you do have the Holy Ghost, which I didn't put here. It's very similar to Skilled Veteran, for instance. Basically, it's just a personal buff where you get damage reduction and endurance just for yourself, and also you're going to get buff duration. So that's very similar to Skilled Veteran, but it's only just for you anyway. With that being said, let's just look at the comparison for both of these. First, I'm going to compare Vanguard and Skilled Veteran. And you see, this is the funny thing right here that I was going to tell you about. This is all because of Undying. You see, the damage is negative. Now, this is really ridiculous. I don't know if this is really intended or it's bugged with the website. I'm not quite sure how this works, but I'm pretty sure it's coming from the Undying epic that you get from the new masteries. And technically both of these negative value. Obviously, this one is slightly higher damage, even though it's negative, but it doesn't mean anything. It's really a bullshit thing when it comes to that. Then we're looking at these stats. Now, on both of the builds, I'm not doing any critical hits. Basically, when we go against the majority of the builds up until now are still using endurance, which means unless you're actually stacking a lot of critical hit chance, which is mostly for DPS builds, this is going to be useless for us because they're going to have some endurance anyway, and we cannot really stack too much with the Crusader. Therefore, it's kind of a waste to get critical hit chance when it comes to PvP specifically. Instead, we want to prioritize heavy attack chance, and it's not really represented here because it's the same for both of them. Most of our DPS is going to be coming from heavy attacks anyway. Hit chance is kind of similar. It's not super high. It's 1800. I know you can go slightly higher as well, and you can adjust some of the items to get like, let's say 2000. But again, if the meta doesn't change too much, you're not going to face too many evasion builds. So keep that in mind. And there's this debate whether endurance or evasion is better. Personally for me, I feel like if your main stat as a class is, let's say, dexterity, as you can see, dexterity gives you evasion in the end. And also every point of dexterity actually increases your evasion a little bit. Your weapon choices should be based on that, so critical hits and evasions. And you may want to choose to go evasion because you're already stacking with this stat. And because we're not stacking dexterity, then it doesn't really make too much sense for me to go evasion anyway as a tank. And naturally, intuitively, the developers have made the game giving you signs. Like if you're a tank, then naturally you should try to endure the attacks. You should try to take the attacks, not evade them, just like any other game basically. When you look at most games, the tanks go for blocks, defense, just, a lot of armor, just protection. You take the damage. It's just mitigated. It's just lower damage anyway. And you have a lot of HP. And then in most games, the opposite would be to evade, dodge, or something like that. And you're going to see very much classes like assassin type of classes, like Rogue in World of Warcraft, or Thief in Guild Wars 2, or, stuff like that, that actually prioritize evasion or some form of that you're going to completely avoid the damage altogether, right? So that's kind of intuitively built into the character designs. That's why I feel like that this whole debate whether evasion or endurance is better, it's really based on your class, just like every other game. So it would be somewhat weird to see a tank going for evasion, even though you do have these options. It just doesn't feel that much natural. It doesn't feel that much the classical type of approach. And then the other side would be if you're using DPS, fast-paced, fast DPS, kind of a class, like for instance, range class or assassin, something like that, that naturally feels a bit squishier, it would make a bit more sense to go with evasion because you're already gonna have it from dexterity anyway. That's my point when it comes to comparing these two stats. But getting back to the build, the defense is somewhat similar. The major difference here comes from the range defense because of skilled veteran. Other than that, you do have quite a lot more endurance simply because this build has the highest overall total stat points on the build because of the fortitude. Like if you pay attention, if you look closely, in tier 1 you have Gilded Raven set, which is also stacking more than 2 stats. Almost every single item has fortitude, which if you think about any other set that has a primary stat, for instance strength or dexterity, none of those sets would have every single item giving you that stat points. For instance, this should be for tanks, right? This is heavy armor. You get strength here. Here you have nothing. Here you have perception, and that's not part of the set. But if you look at skilled veteran, you see we have strength here, and this piece has perception. So basically this set has mix of 2 or 3 different stats, but none of them is predominant. While with any of the fortitude type of sets, you're gonna see every single item has fortitude and something else, which kind of makes you have huge advantage this way, because more total stat points means also more base weapon damage, because every single stat points, regardless of what you're trying to do, is going to give you some damage as well. So overall, this set has some advantage in almost any mod regardless, but in PvP that's going to be great because you do want to get endurance anyway. So you see this is represented right here. You have quite a lot more endurance on everything, which is crazy, especially in PvP. And you also have some heavy attack evasion, which is technically coming from fortitude as well, as you can see. Super good. In late game, you can mix around and actually have a different set, which is Palace Guard, but I didn't include here obviously because some of the items on Palace Guard set come from field bosses, and you can just think for yourself if you want to go that road, because with Palace Guard set you can get the highest block chance because of the actual set bonus. And we can check right here, the block chance on Vanguard is 37.3. The skilled veteran is 37.3. Basically, all of them are 37.3. As you go higher with masteries and other things, you're going to increase a little bit your shield block chance. You can play around with this, but Palace Guard would have the highest block chance anyway. Besides this, here's the stat points. This is the major difference you see. Overall, you just have more total stat points regardless, simply because of the fortitude. When it comes to HP, it's almost the same. So that's kind of a weakness in my opinion, because right now in tier 1, I already have 24,000 HP anyway, so it's like I'm not gonna get any extra HP going to tier 2, but you're gonna get quite a lot of other damage mitigation, so that is actually pretty important. This one actually has a little bit more mana regen and overall mana as well. Then movement speed is actually important in PvP, keep that in mind. So this one is a bit faster when it comes to movement speed. Debuff duration on both of them is actually very small. When it comes to resistance, you're gonna have again slightly higher because of fortitude, but for PvP you want to stack as much as possible stun resistance and collision resistance. Of course, we can't really go that high because this is early game build, but later on you can be stacking even more when it comes to artifacts and resonance effect. You'll be able to just stack more of these things if you want to go this road. So that's with this build. I would probably want to go with Vanguard if I'm just completely going for PvP, but you can probably just play with the Vanguard set in PvE as well. Just be aware that you're not going to have that much HP, obviously. With the other PvE set, you're going to go to like 30,000, even higher the first couple of weeks. And here you see the hybrid type of a PvP PvE build, which is the Wraith Knight compared to Vanguard. This could go just as well for PvE, but keep in mind it's not going to be optimal for any of these, so this is really a risky thing. I just generally like the idea of heavy attack chance and max HP, and then stat representation. Obviously, when you compare that, you have even worse negative damage. You have obviously higher melee heavy attack chance, but again, this doesn't include the actual set bonus, so it's actually way higher than that. This is 370. This is going to go to about 700. So that's like double basically. Keep that in mind. Then hit chance is a little bit less, but you can play around with that and just get it to somewhere the same value. When it comes to defenses and damage reduction, we also have a bit less here. Defense is not a huge difference. Only the magic one coming from fortitude anyway, because at 40 fortitude you get additional 200 magic defense. The endurance obviously is also way less, and heavy attack evasion is also less. So basically fortitude is giving you all these defense stats, which you could use in PvE as well. When it comes to HP, you're gonna have a bit more HP here with the Wraith Knight, but that's like the major difference. Movement speed, this one is a little bit faster on cooldown speed, also a little bit higher. That's basically the biggest weakness in these builds, is the cooldown speed, which is pretty low on both of them. So that may be the biggest change you can do here, is change some of the weapons, but again, you're gonna lose some PvP stats, so that's really up to you. resistances. Once again, fortitude is just dominating when it comes to protections, basically. And then collision chance and stun chance, you have some small difference, which is coming from the 70 perception that we have. And maybe don't rush with things, wait a little bit so that others can test some builds and think for yourself what you need, because you have diminishing returns. You don't want to overstack some stats and go to waste. That's about it for these builds. So I'm gonna post links to the builds and Maxroll gear sources in the description, so you can check them out and play around with stats, play around with these builds, and maybe come up with even better builds than me anyway. So to summarize in the end, Wraith Knight set gives you the highest HP and melee heavy attack chance, but it's mostly good for PvE, and there are not many PvP related stats on it. And also, because I was recording yesterday, heavy attack chance is now fixed and it shows properly on the stat panel. As you can see right now, it says 240. That's the actual value we should get because we're over 20,000 HP anyway. Also, as you can see, some of the actual combat power has been fixed. I'm not sure if this is exactly how it's supposed to look. Another thing to keep in mind, collision and stun resistance are best for PvP, but they're also useful in PvE. Just be aware not to go too crazy about it, because you might hit diminishing returns if people are not stacking too much of that anyway. Nebula accessories seem to be incredibly difficult to obtain based on sources from different websites. So unless they change something about this, about the drop rates, how it works, it's best to not make builds around those accessories. So just use the regular dungeon stuff for now. All hit chances, including crowd controls, are generally not super useful in PvE because minions don't tend to have high evasion, with the exception of critical and heavy attack chance, of course, because this will just increase your overall DPS anyway. But they're actually very important in PvP, especially crowd controls, because people are always stacking crowd control resistance anyway. Also for PvP, try to prioritize damage mitigations over max HP. That would be defense, endurance, heavy attack, evasion, skill damage resistance, and critical damage resistance. And if your build is about evasion, also that as well. It's just overall better than going with HP. And for PvE, both seem to be equally good. Again, you'd have benefit from damage mitigation, but in PvE, you might want to have as high HP as possible, in my opinion. At the moment, Undying seems to be making your main weapon damage go to negative. Until we have tested this, I'm not sure if this is supposed to work that way. Based on that, if this is the case, then if you're planning on using Undying, you should remove all your DPS sword skills and only use greatsword DPS skills, because you're basically going to be doing 0 damage anyway, if that's the case. Also keep in mind, in PvP, as a tank, you're going to have low critical hit chance if the meta continues the same way, which means that most of the people are running endurance, so you're not going to be critting anyway. So don't waste your stat points and traits on critical hit chance or dexterity, because it's going to be suboptimal. And also dexterity is giving you evasion as well, and we're not running evasion on this build. So if you're using half the stat points that a certain attribute is giving you, then that's also suboptimal. Dexterity would be best for players that stack a lot of critical damage and evasion. My personal philosophy with this is obviously heavy armor classes would go for endurance, and then light type of classes would go for evasion. That's kind of the classical approach in most MMOs, so I would just use that same formula. And in this case, for a tank, your best bet for damage in both PvE and PvP, even more important in PvP, is going to be heavy attack chance, because heavy attack evasion is still not as common as other stats, and this is going to be a better approach for you to do more damage, which is basically double damage. So you're not going to do crits, which means you're going to take the lower damage, but you're going to do double of that damage. But if you stack critical hit chance, you're still not guaranteed to do a lot of crits anyway, and you're going to be sacrificing a lot of other more important stats for tank. Also, another way to do some extra damage in both PvE and PvP, it's going to be damage reduction combined with counter barrier, and damage reduction is even stronger in tier 2 because of a lot of different effects that increase damage reduction. Highest melee defense chest is Holy Ghost armor, which is 599, and highest range defense chest is skilled veteran armor that gives you 642. Keep that in mind. And also be aware that still currently we have 4 melee weapons, 2 ranged and 2 magic weapons. So in my personal opinion, melee damage is still the highest threat on the field. If you're trying to counter specific weapons, specific classes, just be aware of that. For the new mastery system, like I mentioned before, try to use as much as possible the vertical and horizontal nodes on the mastery right here, because these don't have any negative impact on your build and only positives. So if you're planning to, let's say, use these 2 sites, then going for these is just perfect, because they'll just count as unlocking both of them, allowing you to add more points into other nodes. While these here will only count for the respective portion. Basically, if I need to unlock, let's say this passive, I would have to use these two. And then if I want to unlock this one, I would have to use these two. So I'm using 2 for each, while in this case, I could basically save 10 points by using one in the middle and one of these, allowing me to put another 10 points into something else that I might need. And also, you may as well actually just go for the 3 lines here that are basically going to unlock all of these passives. If you look at it closely, I barely put any points in here, and I've got all of these because of these vertical nodes right here. But that's only if your build allows it, if what you're aiming for is on these sections, obviously. It's going to be different for everybody. I just managed to do it this way. In my opinion, Vanguard Set is best for PvP for early game because of the high endurance. And also you can mix it with skilled veterans, so you have even more endurance early on, but that's really up to you. For late game, for PvP specifically, I would go with Vanguard Set if I have the chance, because some of the items are from field bosses, but eventually the price will go lower and you'll be able to actually get this set as well, which can go to around 60 block chance without any buffs, which is pretty significant. Most of the other builds that I managed to go around are going in between this range with like 45-46% block chance. And to me, Vanguard Set is basically an upgraded version of Shock Commander right now. It's basically all about blocks and damage reduction, so that's pretty powerful for both PvE and PvP. And that's going to be the summary of the key things you want to be aware of when you're making your tank build for tier 2. And that's going to be for this video, guys. If you enjoyed the content, hit the subscribe and notification button so you can see more videos like that. Thank you for watching and see you soon.